I never meant to return to the coast. The Mariner's Rest was supposed to be a relic of my childhood, a place sealed in memories and the scent of salt air, left behind when I moved to Chicago for college and never looked back. But grief has a strange way of calling you home, and when our father died unexpectedly, I found myself standing in the cracked shell of the hotel he once built with his bare hands and a heart full of dreams. The paint was peeling, the windows fogged with grime, and the front lawn, once a lush green welcome mat for travelers, was brown, patchy, and littered with wind-blown trash. It wasn't just a building in decline. It was a legacy on the verge of vanishing. My name is Elena Brooks. I was 32 and newly laid off from a job that never fed my soul. Dad's death hit like a freight train, not just because it was sudden, but because it opened a chasm I didn't realize existed. There was no one else to pick up the pieces. My older brother Nathan had been estranged for years, off chasing get-rich-quick schemes that never stuck. So it fell to me, the daughter who left and promised never to come back, to figure out what to do with a dying hotel and a mountain of unpaid bills. The first night I slept there, I cried in the very room my parents once called their own. I remember the water-stained ceiling, the musty carpet, the single bulb flickering like it was protesting my decision. But as dawn crept in, casting golden light over the warped floorboards, I felt something strange, hope. Not the kind you shout from rooftops, but the quiet kind that tugs at your sleeve and whispers, "Try." And so I did. The next few months became a blur of learning things I never imagined I'd need to know. How to fix a faulty boiler, how to unclog drains without calling a plumber, how to bargain with wholesalers for bulk linens and breakfast supplies. I read books on hospitality, watched YouTube tutorials until my eyes burned, and begged the remaining 2 staff members not to leave. I renamed rooms with warm, nostalgic titles like Seafarer's Nook and The Captain's View. I repainted every hallway myself, one aching wrist at a time. I offered discounts for local events, partnered with food vendors, and started an Instagram account showcasing sunsets from our balcony. Slowly, bookings trickled in. It wasn't glamorous. In fact, it was humiliating at times. I once slipped in a puddle while scrubbing the lobby floor, only to have a guest step over me like I was invisible. There were nights I fell asleep on the office couch, surrounded by spreadsheets and receipts, and mornings I woke to emails from creditors reminding me of debts I inherited but never asked for. Still, each time a guest checked out with a smile, it felt like winning a battle in a war no one knew I was fighting. People in town began to notice. Old guests returned, curious about the new Mariner's Rest. Travel bloggers wrote modest reviews. A couple even got engaged in the garden after I restored the fairy lights Dad had hung years ago. It wasn't just a business anymore. It was becoming a place people trusted with their stories. I didn't do it alone. I'll never claim that. Marcy, our housekeeper, was the backbone of operations. She had stayed during the worst of it and never let me forget what mattered: kindness and consistency. Darren, a local chef who had just been laid off, agreed to run our weekend brunch in exchange for exposure and tips. We became a family, of sorts, a strange, ragtag team held together by shared fatigue and stubborn belief. By the end of that first year, we broke even. For the first time in nearly a decade, the hotel wasn't bleeding money. I remember standing in the parking lot, staring at the full occupancy board and laughing, not from joy exactly, but from disbelief. It had worked. I had saved it. I called my mom, who had moved to Arizona after Dad's passing, and told her the news. She cried. She said he would be proud. I wanted to believe that. I let myself believe it. That winter, I decorated the lobby with handmade wreaths and fresh pine branches. We hosted a small Christmas Eve gathering for guests and locals alike. There were cookies, carols, and a moment where it all felt worth it. The sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the physical exhaustion. We survived. And not just survived, we'd grown. Looking back, I think that year was the calm before the storm. I had no idea what was coming. No idea who was about to walk through those glass double doors, smiling like he owned the place. My brother Nathan. The same man who hadn't returned Dad's calls for 3 years. The same man who once told me I'd never last a month in the hospitality industry. The same man who now claimed he had a vision for the hotel. For now, let me hold on to this part of the journey, the chapter where I learned what resilience meant, where I discovered I was capable of building something from ruin, where, for the first time in my adult life, I wasn't running away, I was rebuilding a home. And in doing so, I found myself again. It was a Tuesday morning when Nathan returned. I still remember the sound of the bell above the lobby door ringing, a gentle chime that normally announced new guests or the delivery man. But when I looked up from the reservation desk, it wasn't a stranger I saw. It was the ghost of someone I'd almost stopped thinking about, wrapped in a tailored blazer and designer sunglasses, carrying the kind of smirk that made your stomach twist. My brother. "Elena," he said like we were meeting for lunch, not after 3 years of silence. "This place looks surprisingly alive." I stood there frozen for a moment, unsure whether to hug him or throw him out. In the end, I chose neither. "What are you doing here, Nathan?" He walked further inside, his loafers clicking against the new hardwood floor I had laid with my own hands. He scanned the renovated space with an assessing glance, his mouth tightening slightly as if disappointed that the place wasn't in shambles. "I heard about Dad. Late, obviously. I was overseas. And then I heard about the miracle you pulled off here. Quite the comeback story. Thought I'd come see it for myself." There was no apology. No acknowledgement of the years he spent ignoring our family's calls, especially in the months Dad was in and out of the hospital. Just casual commentary, like he was a tourist in someone else's life. He stayed longer than I wanted him to. One night became two became a week. He charmed guests with practiced smiles, told stories about his adventures in Dubai and Singapore, and asked probing questions about our finances, our booking numbers, our future plans. I was cautious, but part of me, some small, hopeful part, wondered if maybe he had changed, if grief had matured him, if just maybe he wanted to help. Then came the bombshell. Mom had quietly added Nathan back into the family trust before she moved to Arizona. Legally, we were co-owners. I found out not from him, but from our lawyer, after Nathan submitted paperwork proposing a new wing to the hotel, a rooftop bar, modern suites, and an event space. It sounded grand. It also sounded like debt, risk, and everything I had fought to protect us from. I confronted him in the old sunroom, the one Dad used to read the paper in every morning. Nathan leaned back in a chair with a coffee he didn't make, flipping through a design proposal he had no right to submit. "Because you would have said no, which you still can, technically, but I figured if you saw the numbers, the projections. We're not a resort, Nathan. We're not a chain. We're a family hotel. We survive because of authenticity. People come here to escape the very thing you're trying to turn us into." His smile turned thin. "You mean the thing that makes real money? Elena, you did great reviving this place, I'll give you that. But you're thinking too small. We could take this to another level." He wasn't asking, he was telling. That's what chilled me the most. Within weeks, he started acting like he ran the place. He changed the uniforms, got rid of the cozy seaside attire, and ordered sleek black outfits that made our staff look like nightclub waiters. He replaced the vintage lobby music with electronic lounge beats. He fired Darren, the chef who had helped us survive the first year, claiming his brunch menu was too quaint. The reviews began to shift. Guests who once praised our charm now complained about the corporate feel. The once loyal couple who celebrated anniversaries here every year canceled their upcoming reservation, citing that the new vibe was soulless. I tried to push back. I held meetings, pleaded for balance, reminded him what made the Mariners' Rest special. He told me, to my face, that I was emotionally attached and incapable of seeing the bigger picture. The final straw came when he authorized a deal with a third-party booking company that oversold rooms during a holiday weekend. We were overwhelmed, understaffed, and facing guests with double bookings and nowhere to stay. It was a PR disaster. I worked 18-hour days trying to salvage what I could, personally driving guests to other hotels and paying for their stays out of my own pocket. When I finally collapsed on my office floor after that weekend, I realized something vital. Nathan didn't want to build. He wanted to brand, to sell. He saw the hotel as a stepping stone, not a home. And in his ambition, he was hollowing out the very soul of what I had rebuilt. I met with a financial advisor the following week. Quietly, I began separating what assets I could. I moved some funds, updated legal contacts, and started documenting everything, every change he made, every cost he incurred without my consent. I reached out to our former guests, old contacts, and even some local business owners who'd been burned by Nathan's arrogance. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was preservation. But before I could act, things got worse. Nathan announced at a town chamber event that we'd be launching a rebrand. A new name. A new image. "The Mariner's Rest is becoming the Horizon Luxe," he declared from a podium, lights flashing, as if he were introducing a tech startup, not desecrating our father's legacy. I watched from the back of the room, unable to breathe. He hadn't even told me. He didn't need to. Legally, as co-owner, he could make executive decisions without my approval if he deemed them strategic. It was all in the fine print Mom never explained. And now, the hotel I had saved was being swallowed by the very thing it had never been meant to become. I went home that night and cried harder than I had since Dad died. Not because I was losing the hotel, but because I felt like I was losing him again. Not Nathan, Dad, his memory, his dream, and mine. But somewhere in that darkness, a spark ignited. A realization. If Nathan could manipulate the system, so could I. If he could play the long game, I could outlast him. And that's when I began the plan, not to fight for the hotel he was ruining, but to build something better, without him. By the time spring rolled in, the Haven had become more than just a destination. It was a refuge. The wildflowers bloomed in unruly bunches along the property's edge, bees buzzed like lazy violins in the air, and guests walked barefoot through the dewy grass in the mornings, coffee in hand and wonder on their faces. We weren't the biggest or the fanciest, but we were something Nathan's hotel could never be. Loved. And with that love came an idea I hadn't dared entertain until then, a full expansion. It began with an email. The sender's name was Geraldine Shaw. I recognized it immediately. Years ago, she and her daughter had stayed at the Mariner's Rest during a difficult period in their lives. Geraldine was recovering from chemotherapy, and her daughter had just lost a job. I remembered how Geraldine used to sit in the garden every morning, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of tea, watching the sunrise like it was a miracle she'd been given permission to witness. In her email, Geraldine told me she had followed my story. Quietly. She had seen the shift at Mariner S, then discovered the Haven. She had stayed under an alias, she confessed, just a month prior, tucked away in the Wildflower Suite, and had written one of the glowing reviews that boosted our spring bookings. She wanted to invest. Not in a silent partner kind of way. She wanted to be the wind at our back, her words, not mine. I met her in person a week later at a cafe 2 towns over. She was older now, of course, but radiant. Her white curls framed her face like soft armor, and her presence filled the space with a quiet steadiness I had long associated with wisdom. We talked for hours, not just about business, but about loss, memory, and what it means to build something that heals people. She told me her fortune came from publishing, but her passion had always been spaces, places that made people feel held. She said the Haven was the first place in a decade that had done that for her, and she wanted to help it do the same for more people. By the end of lunch, she had offered a $5 million investment. I almost choked on my tea. We structured the deal carefully. She would fund the purchase and renovation of a nearby orchard property that had once been a wellness retreat. I would lead the design and operation. The new space would include 8 guest rooms, a meditation garden, an artist studio, and a weekend storytelling workshop series for guests who wanted to explore their own journeys. We called it the Grove. And that's when things began to truly shift. The announcement made waves in the local news. A second location, a meaningful expansion. While Nathan's Horizon Luxe slashed rates to attract guests, we opened bookings 6 months in advance and sold out in 2 days. Nathan called me. I hadn't heard his voice since he left the Haven. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in me, maybe pride, maybe curiosity, picked up. "Elena," he said, and for the first time there was no smugness in it, just exhaustion. "I need to talk." He wanted to meet in person. I agreed, cautiously, and chose a public cafe where I knew the owner. He looked thinner, paler, like someone who hadn't been sleeping well for weeks. "Things aren't good," he admitted. "Investors are out, staff is leaving faster than I can hire, and he hesitated. "I thought I could do this on my own, thought I knew better, but I don't." It would have been so easy to relish that moment, to gloat, but I didn't, because underneath all his failures, he was still my brother. The one who used to chase me around the beach when we were kids, who taught me how to tie my shoelaces, who stood beside me when Dad was buried. "I'm not giving you money, Nathan," I said gently, "and I'm not merging brands, but I might. Consider buying you out." He looked at me like I'd just handed him a life raft. "Seriously?" "I want the Mariners' Rest back, in name and in soul. I'll restore it the right way, but it has to be mine, entirely." He paused, then nodded. "You've already done what I couldn't. Maybe it's time to let you finish it." The deal took weeks, mostly to untangle the mess he'd made. But in the end, he signed the papers. I wired him the agreed amount, a mix of my own earnings and a private supplement from Geraldine, who believed in completing the circle. And just like that, the Mariners' Rest came home. I stood in its lobby the next morning, alone, hands on the old counter. The place looked tired, neglected, but I could see past it. I saw the wood paneling beneath the garish wallpaper Nathan had added, the hidden charm behind the hollow luxury. I could almost hear Dad's footsteps in the hallway. The first thing I did was take down the awful Horizon Lux sign. The second was bring back Marcy. Restoration began immediately. Not a return to the past, but a revival of its heart. We reopened slowly, deliberately. The guests noticed. They felt it, and they returned. One couple cried when they saw their old room had been renamed the Captain's Legacy. In the months that followed, the Mariners' Rest, the Haven, and the Grove operated like a constellation of safe harbors. People came to us not because we were trendy, but because they wanted to feel something real, and we gave it to them. Sometimes Nathan visits. He always brings a bottle of wine, and we sit on the porch and talk, not about money, but about memory. He's changed. Or maybe he's just remembered who he was before the ambition took over. Either way, I no longer carry the anger, only distance and peace. One night, as I walked the grounds of the Grove, Geraldine beside me, she asked what I thought Dad would say. I smiled, probably that I took the scenic route, but that I finally made it. She laughed softly. "You made more than it, Elena. You made magic." And in that moment, surrounded by stars, lavender fields, and lives being quietly mended in every corner of our little empire, I believed her. There's something haunting about restoration. It's not just about paint and polish. It's about peeling away the mistakes, the neglect, the ego-driven decisions of the past, and trying to find the truth underneath. The Mariners' Rest was no longer a hotel, it was a metaphor. A story etched in floorboards and windowsills, waiting to be told again, properly this time. I spent that spring between properties, often waking up in one and falling asleep in another. My car became my mobile office, with folders in the backseat and a thermos of coffee always within reach. At the Haven, we were opening a new meditation deck by the creek. At the Grove, our storytelling weekends had become so popular we began turning people away. And at the Mariners' Rest, I was laying hands on the ghost of my father's dream, one piece of crown molding at a time. The hardest part wasn't the work, it was the weight, the emotional gravity of rebuilding something that had been stripped of its dignity. Guests had returned, yes, but so had their memories, and with them came the expectations. "This is where we got engaged," one woman said, her fingers trailing the edges of a newly sanded windowsill. "The night he proposed, there were candles in this room. I cried so hard, I didn't even say yes. He had to ask again." I nodded and smiled, hiding how overwhelmed I felt, because that's what this place was. It wasn't just mine. It belonged to stories like hers. to echoes of laughter, whispered confessions, and tiny moments no spreadsheet could measure. One afternoon, as I was sorting through old files in the back office, I found a handwritten journal Dad's. It wasn't labeled or formal, just tucked between tax folders and outdated invoices. The entries were sporadic. Some were musings on weather patterns, others half-written menus, but some were heartbreakingly intimate. I hope they'll forgive me for being gone too much. For missing recitals, birthdays, I just wanted to give them something solid, a place they could come back to when everything else failed. I read that sentence a dozen times. My throat tightened, because I had returned. Not when I planned to, not under happy circumstances, but I had. And I was keeping it alive for him, for us, for everyone who needed it. That night I added something to the lobby, a small corner by the fireplace, the memory shelf. Guests could leave behind something, a note, a photograph, a book that meant something. No rules, no explanation required, just presence. It became an instant tradition. Some left drawings, others trinkets. One guest left a poem about her late husband who had loved our ocean view more than any place on earth. In June, Geraldine invited me to a gala in the city, an event hosted by a foundation for women-led businesses in hospitality. I almost declined. I wasn't one for crowds, and I didn't care much for the awards. But she insisted. "People need to see what humility and leadership looks like," she said. The ballroom was gold and marble, filled with voices that talked too loudly and champagne that tasted like static. I wore the only real dress I owned, a soft navy gown that Marcy had ironed for me in the guest laundry room. I felt out of place until they started reading the list of honorees. And this year, we recognize Elena Brooks, founder of the Haven, the Grove, and the Restored Mariner's Rest, for her unwavering commitment to soul-centered hospitality. People clapped, cameras flashed. I walked up to the stage like I was in someone else's body. When I reached the podium, I looked out at the glittering crowd and said the only thing that came to mind. We don't build spaces, we build invitations, to feel, to heal, to remember. And if we do it right, those invitations don't expire, they grow. It wasn't rehearsed, but it landed. Geraldine beamed. I slipped away early, trophy in hand, heels dangling from one finger, walking barefoot to the car. The next morning, back at the Mariner's Rest, I found Nathan sitting in the garden. He looked different these days, softer. He still wore nice clothes, but his eyes didn't have the constant flicker of calculation. He came by occasionally to help with repairs, always with a kind of humility that surprised me. "You were on the news," he said. He smiled, then turned serious. "You did what I never could. You didn't just save it, you made it matter again." I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. Later that week, we held our first official legacy weekend. It was something Marcy had suggested, a weekend retreat for families who had stayed with us across generations. We invited them to come, share stories, and reconnect with a place that had been part of their personal histories. They came in droves. We had bonfires, cooking DMOS, late-night storytelling circles. We created a time capsule where guests could write letters to themselves 10 years from now. Children played tag in the halls. Elderly couples slow danced in the lobby. And somewhere in that chaos of joy, I found myself standing by the door, watching the hotel glow from within and realizing. This was what Dad meant. He didn't just want us to have a business. He wanted us to have a lighthouse, something to guide us back when the world got too dark. And somehow, through grief and betrayal, failure and fire, I had become its keeper. There would be challenges ahead. There always are. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of them, because I had roots, I had people, and I had a legacy that no one could take from me. Not even time. Summer ended slowly, like a story that didn't want to finish. The skies turned softer, the waves a little more patient as if they too were catching their breath. The Mariner's Rest, now fully reborn, glowed in the amber evenings with a peace I had only imagined before. There were flowers in every window box, handwritten notes tucked under guest doors, and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen each morning. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. It was honest. We hosted a wedding in September. It was the daughter of one of our earliest guests. Her parents had gotten engaged here years ago and returned almost every anniversary since. When she asked if we'd hold the ceremony in the same garden where her mother had once said yes, I knew we had done something right. I stood at the back as they exchanged vows, tears quietly falling down my cheeks, not out of sadness, but from the extraordinary privilege of bearing witness. This place wasn't just a business anymore. It was a thread in the fabric of people's lives. And then, just as everything felt steady, I received a letter that would change everything again. It was from a historical preservation group based in Boston. They had heard about our work, from a guest, from a journalist, it wasn't clear, but they were nominating the Mariners' Rest for national recognition. Not just for restoration, but for cultural significance. It would be the first hotel of its size and background to receive such an honor in our state. I sat with the letter for an hour, rereading it, unsure whether to laugh or cry. When I called Geraldine, she responded simply, Of course they see it now." But the recognition meant more than an award. It meant attention, grants, visitors from far beyond our sleepy shoreline. It meant we would grow again. And for the first time, I hesitated. That night, I walked the property alone. The breeze carried the scent of rosemary and lavender, the same herbs Dad used to plant near the porch. I paused by the memory shelf. Someone had left a key. No note, just a small, rusted key on a piece of twine. I stared at it, trying to guess its story, but realizing I didn't need to know. The story was in the offering. I walked to room 12, Dad's favorite room, the one with the creaky floorboard near the window, and sat on the edge of the bed. In the silence, I heard the hum of 100 stories. People who had cried here, laughed here, made decisions and mistakes and found peace. And I realized that whatever came next, the soul of this place would survive. Because we had chosen to remember. The next week, I met with our staff, not just from the Mariners' Rest, but from the Haven and the Grove. We filled the sunroom with mismatched chairs and pastries and coffee, and I told them about the letter, the nomination, the potential. But I also told them something more important. "We don't need to be the biggest," I said. "We need to be the most meaningful. Every guest who walks through our doors should feel like the story they're living is the most important one in the world. Because to them, it is." Marcy nodded, Darren smiled, and the others, they clapped. That fall, we began creating a new program called Legacy Letters. Every guest was invited to write a letter to someone they'd lost, someone they missed, or even to their future selves. We provided paper, envelopes, and a promise. If they ever wanted the letter sent back to them, or to someone else, we'd do it. Some wrote simple notes, "Thank you, Dad." Others poured their hearts out. One man, an Army veteran, wrote to his best friend who had died overseas. He left the letter sealed, with a photograph from their youth. 2 months later, he emailed us to say it was the first time in 10 years he'd felt like he could breathe again. Healing doesn't always look like triumph. Sometimes, it looks like a quiet envelope left in a wooden box. Nathan, surprisingly, asked to return, not to run things, but to be part of them. He had started working at a small nonprofit in Portland that helped at-risk youth develop job skills, and he wondered if we could host retreats for them at the Haven. I said yes. Not because I owed him, but because I believed in redemption. He helped with the fall gardens, taught the teens how to build planter boxes, and even led a fireside talk one evening about failure. Honest, raw, no gloss. I watched from the back as one of the boys leaned in, captivated. And I thought, maybe this was always the version of Nathan that had been buried under the noise. Mom came to visit in November. She walked the halls with a quiet reverence, touching the wallpaper, running her hands along the banisters like they were old friends. She spent most of her time in the library, curled up with tea and photo albums, and one evening she said, "Your father would have cried, Elena, not just because you saved it, but because you brought it to life." I cried then too. We closed out the year with a winter solstice celebration, candles lit for each guest, a moment of silence for everything we'd let go of, and a toast to what still lay ahead. The sky that night was impossibly clear, and someone said they saw a comet. I didn't look. I didn't need to. Because the miracle wasn't in the stars. It was here. In the creak of the front door. In the hum of the fireplace. In the way people held each other longer before saying goodbye. One night, long after the guests had gone to bed, I sat at the front desk alone, hands resting on the old guest book. I turned back to the first page I had rewritten when I took it all over again. The ink was faded now, but the lines still read. Welcome home. We've been waiting for you. That's what I had always needed to hear. And now, I had built a place where others could hear it too. That, to me, was the best revenge. Not success, but meaning. And in the quiet glow of that restored lobby, I knew this wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a legacy.